year, and we really appreciate Cory coming out to give this talk for us. The museum has such a great history, and we haven't really been able to focus on that in the past because we've been trying to stay open. The museum is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, so we are working hard to make sure that it is here for future generations to enjoy. I just wanted to share with you, if you're interested, we have our 25th anniversary pins, and you can get that with a donation of $25. They're at the door. And there's also a silent auction happening back here, so if you want to come see what's going on there, please check that out before you go. But I just wanted to tell you thank you so much. I appreciate you all for coming out and enjoy the talk. I know it's going to be great. Cory is really an awesome curator over at Fort Concho, and he's taken really good care of that, and he's very familiar with the history. So I'm excited for people to learn more about how important this railroad is to the community and how it made us who we are today. And also that it's not just a train museum. It is a beautiful train museum, but we have a lot of roots creating this city. And we just did a play about Arthur Stilwell. This is a new exhibit that we have. So we're really focusing on bringing that history to life so people can enjoy that. And I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you for taking the time to come out. We appreciate it.
I guess really quickly, I'm Rocio. I'm on the exec board as well. I'm the treasurer. We just really want to welcome Cory. I worked with him for about 6 years while I worked at Fort Concho. He is a native to this area. He was born in Vermont. He attended Angelo State University and has both a bachelor's and a master's in history. He's volunteered at Fort Concho. He's also he started as a volunteer at Fort Concho, then he moved to be a visitor service coordinator, and then eventually with the position that he has now as the curator. He is responsible for thousands and thousands of objects, maintaining and preserving them. So we're really excited that he is here, and he's kind of merging both of the worlds of the history of the fort, but also how railroads impacted garrisons like Fort Concho. So we're excited that he's here, and I'll turn the time over to him for his presentation.
Okay. So yeah, when they asked me about giving a talk, I definitely wanted to concentrate on something I really know, and that's the military history and Fort Concho history. So I want to kind of merge those together. So for a while, forget all this. Because I'm going to talk about this one right here, which was the first of the depots to be created in San Angelo, and the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe Railroad that will come in. But I also wanted to bring in the importance of the military and railroad and how the railroad would affect Texas frontier and all the frontier forts in Texas. And then a little bit later discuss exactly how it affected Fort Concho, as in when it first arrived, 1888 into 1889 when the fort actually closed, and maybe why it was a reason for Fort Concho closing. So we will discuss that. First, I'm going to talk about the military presence and their connection to the railroad. So how did the military use the railroad in the frontier army? So forget the American Civil War and that time period. We're now into the late 1860s, 1870s with the Texas frontier, the creation of the new forts. And if you're not familiar with Fort Concho, it was established in December of 1867. So this is right after the Civil War, a few years after the Civil War, creation of Fort Concho and the other forts like Fort Griffin, the reestablishment of forts like Fort Davis and Fort McCavitt. And so Fort Concho would be one of those new forts. It was just built right across the way. Of course, no railroad, no town, no anything here, except for a little bit of the Ben Ficklin area. There was that Bismarck farm, and that was about it. But because of the water supply, because of the location compared to the other forts, maybe about a 30 to 40 mile distance between them, this was a good location to establish the site. But there was no railroad here at that time period. And so most of the transportation had, relying on the wagons, relying on being on foot, on horseback, and that was pretty much it. That was your only options. So when the railroad was available, and we'll talk about when it finally comes in for this area, railroads were supplanting the long overland routes of travel and commerce. So this will eventually take the place of the need for the wagons. Not that it went away completely, but as far as the military use of the wagons, it would take some time for that to go away, and then finally relying heavily on the railroad. They made it possible for troops to be rapidly dispatched from one place to another if needed. But the government wasn't going to spend a whole lot of money in putting 50 men on a train and having them go from point A to point B. It was a lot more cost effective to have them walk that distance or ride that distance. So don't let this fool you. They didn't utilize the railroad in this time period that often to transport troops in the Texas frontier from point A to point B. Now, for the railroad coming in, it was usually from the Gulf, where a lot of supplies would come up from the Gulf of Mexico. You would hit those points, and then from there, usually go into Austin or San Antonio. And then from those places, they would distribute out goods, men, what have you, from that area. So that's where it really started, from San Antonio and Austin. After the Civil War, many of the military rail lines, and that's not just Texas and the West, that's going to be all over, were sold off. So the military had created a lot of rail line on their own with their own money, the government did, and then eventually they sold that off. Now, one thing that they did is they used selling the railroad as credit so that the military could utilize it for free for a while. So some of these private companies that would purchase up the railroad from them, they would use that transportation for free for a while. For a short time period, the Army had that free transportation on several of the Texas railroads. The Quartermaster Department sold off approximately 433 engines, 6,605 rail cars, and about 2,630 miles of track. So they did have a lot. In 1865, there was only about 3,200 miles of track that existed in the West, but by 1890, so this is between the Mississippi and the Pacific coast, they had about 70,000 miles. So that is a big jump. Always lagging behind, though, was that southern route from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all the way to California. So they were always lagging behind for that. By the mid-1880s, railroads were starting to supply forts, but it depended on how close you were to the railhead or the rail stop. So if you were not close enough, sometimes it was get the goods and troops, soldiers, individual or by a few individuals, get them to a location. By foot, they would go the rest of the way, or by wagon, they would go the rest of the way. Even cavalry soldiers that were coming out here, as far as enlistees, they didn't have their horse just yet. They would have to get their horse when they finally arrived at the site. So they would have to be on foot for a certain time. And you can just imagine if you got to San Antonio and there was no railroad out to this point, you would have to walk or be in a wagon from San Antonio to Fort Concho. Enhanced transportation was evident in many of the available goods that had formerly been scarce. So not just the people and military items, but think of even food. Now, food could be transported out to these forts and towns, but I'm concentrating on the military. So various food items that might not have been available because maybe it would spoil in that time that wagons would take it. Maybe that transportation, the faster transportation, you might have some food items that were not available before. Used in times of rapid deployment, near major campaigns, or sometimes they would have these chartered special trains that would get the soldiers to major campaigns, but again, not all the time would they use the rail line. Mail service also. Mail by foot, mail by stagecoach, mail by wagon, but if you were close to the railroad, then you could put it on the rail line and have it transported out. Okay. I know it's hard to see from your distance, but these are two pretty good maps that were put together by Thomas T. Smith, who wrote a book called The U.S. Army and the Texas Frontier Economy. And it's a quantitative research, so it's all the numbers and data put together to show you exactly how much the military spent and what they spent their money on. And so this shows you Army Quartermaster Supply System in 1870. And you have the rail lines coming to a certain point, but then everything else is wagons. Then fast forward over to 1886, now you have the rail lines coming in. Now you have the more rail lines coming in, and they either hit some of these forts, or like Fort Concho, it's too far away from that rail line. And so by 1886, the rail had come through, number one, Abilene, and then finally Ballinger. And so now you could get stuff sent to Abilene, and from there on wagon to Fort Concho, or send stuff to Ballinger, and then on wagon to Fort Concho. So you still had that distance to make right there. But look at the difference from relying on the wagons and those roads Now you're heavily relying on the rail line to bring stuff in. It brought costs down, and it was a lot quicker to bring items and people in. This image right here shows you a small group, a small squad that are accompanying a supply wagon, and this is probably up in the Dakotas, about, I would say about 1885 to 1890, but very typical of wagon transportation as far as supply wagons, escort wagons for the military. And I wanted to bring this in to kind of show you how much wagon transportation would cost. So in 1869, per 100 pounds, it was $3.50. In 1881, when the Texas and Pacific finally reaches Abilene, now for 100 pounds, it was about $1.37. So that's a big change. 85 miles it took by wagon to get from the railhead at Abilene to Fort Concho. But that then becomes a reduction of about 79% from 1869. In 1887, finally the rail had finally reached Ballinger. Now it was 27 cents. So from 1869 at $3.50, 1887, it now cost just that minimal amount, 27 cents to get 100 pounds of items shipped to Fort Concho. By 1890, the Army had paid less than about $5,000 for Texas wagon freight. So as the rail line came in, the cost for the military went down dramatically. Okay. All these names right here are individuals that worked transporting items to and from Fort Concho and other military forts via wagon. And there's a lot of the same names and a few different ones because you would do it usually by a yearly contract. So the government would contract out with an individual, and that individual would have his workers, and then they would transport items to the various posts. The end of the long-distance Army freighting in Texas came in about 1884 when almost all the posts, except for Fort Elliott, which was up in the Panhandle, were really close to a fort. All the rail lines were really close to a fort. But about 4 to 5 individuals had still made a living in these years moving items to and from different posts. Some of the names might be familiar. Hardin Adams and Edwin Wicks of San Antonio. That is the same group, that's the same company that owned Fort Concho because the fort was never owned by the military. It was owned by Adams and Wicks. They had the land, so they leased that land to the military, and for almost 22 years, the military had to pay them yearly at least. It was anywhere from $200 to about $300 that they would have to lease the land. So they were actually wagon freighters as well. And then all the way down, you'll see some of the same names. But I want to bring out just one because they had some numbers right here. So Jackson Labatt, for that 85-mile run from Abilene to Fort Concho, the Army paid him yearly $10,473 for the year. That's pretty good wages for that time period. It's heavy and laborious work, but that's pretty good wages for that time period. All right. As far as I know, it wasn't on a regular basis, but every month you definitely have 1 or 2 runs, more than likely. But I never saw where it had a kind of a scheduled, regular basis. Sometimes it depended on what the quartermaster and the Army had requested and how it arrived here and when it could get here and delays in getting the stuff to this point, to the railhead. So it wasn't on a constant basis, but at least 1 to 2 times a month they would have a rundown. And it's not just goods and people. Sometimes it was forage for the animals or lumber for construction. You had to get glass brought in, right, for the windows. So things like that would have to be shipped in as well. Now let's look at the individual soldier for a second and show how the rail line was important for them, because most of the soldiers at Fort Concho were not from Texas. They were from New York, and they were from Pennsylvania, and they were from Germany and Ireland, and they were from places in South America. They were slaves and sons of former slaves. They were from the Carolinas and Virginia. They were almost everywhere except for Texas, because they enlisted over there on the East Coast, in the South, in New York, wherever, and then they were shipped out here. So how did you get them out here? Well, transportation via the railroad was fairly good in those regions, but you got pretty much to the Mississippi and it kind of breaks off. Now the rail line eventually made its way to Fort Worth, Denison, that area. There was a railhead, rail stop there, but from that point you had to go down maybe get to San Antonio if you had to meet up with your company there, or maybe go to Austin if you had to meet up your company there. But if you had to go to Fort McCavett or Fort Concho, there was going to be some walking involved. And you may come in as a group of 10 or maybe as a group of 5, and there might not be a wagon available to you that you could get on and ride the rest of the way, so you probably did have to walk. So getting them from point A to point B to finally meet up from their enlistment to their training at the depots, and then finally to where they're assigned, you would have to get them to all those locations. And the rail might provide that at some point. So the recruitment stations, to rendezvous in the larger cities, to the recruitment depots, places like New York, Pennsylvania, St. Louis, Kansas at Fort Leavenworth, even Virginia, there's a lot of training areas there. And then from that point, once your training is over, which may be about 3 months, maybe a month, depending on what's needed in time period, then you have to come out here to the vast frontier. Think of having to try to get out to California if your regiment and company is out in California. And it's the same scenario. You take the rail line as far as you can go, and then from there, you're going to have to walk the rest of the way. Dispatch from rails from the depots in the Northwest and San Francisco for distribution to the regiments. In that area, there's a small amount of soldiers that were going to California in those areas, but still some would go. Always beginning with the train ride, though, because the military is going to try to save as much as they can, and they're going to try to get them out here as fast as they can. So getting to your assignment is going to involve at least a small section of being on the rail. Before the advent of the Transcontinental Railroad, only as far as construction, right? So that Mississippi is pretty much the boundary right there. And then you have to wait until the mid-1880s before it really gets out into the Texas frontier. Some only as far as the nearest seaport. And really in Texas, the only way you would hit like a seaport area is down on the Gulf, Brownsville, those regions right there, coming up a little ways. There's other states that you can come off the river, maybe utilizing some sort of river transportation. But as far as the seaport, some of those boats in Texas, it's really down there on that border with Mexico. By rail to the west was the most expeditious and economical means for the government to transport the large number of men from depots to permanent unions, or at least close to them, like I said. From rail to the agonizing trek on foot or other dry, treeless plains or deserts, possible wagon transportation, but small chance of that, maybe for some of the smaller groups. From 1869 to 1897, the Army paid railroads in Texas $570,000, a little over $570,000 from those years, 1869 to 1887. That represented about 19% of the post-Civil War Army transportation costs. By 1889, 74% of Army freight was by railroad. In general, Texas railroads reduced the Army's cost of transportation by 80 to 90% when compared to wagon freight. Big change. I brought this in because I found some funny stories when I was researching this. These soldiers weren't the best of the best and the elite many times. Sometimes these soldiers were running from the law, running from problems, running from their families, leaving their wife. And maybe it's not even the real name that they assigned under, right? That they put on the paperwork. So they may not have been the best of the best, but that's human nature, right? So on the rail line, you got to act like a soldier. If you have a group of 30 on there and they're mixed in 4 cars, there's probably 1 to 4 individuals that are going to be in charge. And they may not be officers. They may be some of the enlisted men just given the job of being in charge. So you're probably no better than the soldier right next to you, but they said you're in charge, so you have to keep this rowdy group in check. Unruly behavior on trains. Whole lot of singing and messing around, fighting, drinking, damage to the trains, etc. Ripping stuff off. Selling items to the locals at the train stops. So you might have basic items given to you. Maybe one of them was a blanket. And one of the tricks they would do is the rail car came up and all the soldiers were hanging out the windows. They would have these blankets that were tied to each other. And so they come out and they see the locals and say, hey, you want to buy a blanket? I'll sell it to you for cheap. And the local comes up and says, oh, that looks like a good blanket. I'll give you however much for it. I'll give you 25 cents. I'll give you $1 for it, whatever. Oh, that's a good price. I think we'll do that. So they're talking, and they keep talking, and they exchange the money, and then the guy comes up to try to grab the blanket, and they pulling on the blanket, and it won't come out, and all of a sudden the train just goes away, and the blanket is still hanging. And what they did is they tied a bunch of blankets together, so when the guy came and tried to pull it, they were all tied, and you couldn't get it out. And they got the dollar and then left on the train, and that's a true story. Desertion was easy on the train. If your name is already not known everywhere, right? Your name is not on a national list, and we don't have the computers to check your name. You can leave and nobody really knows. So desertion on the train was pretty easy. While moving from the depot to the assignment, or if assigned to a post and close to a rail line, that's perfect. Get on the train and you're gone. Make your way east and nobody knows that you're leaving. Buy tickets, board the train, and you're gone. If you deserted, there's a railroad network. It was well developed in the east by that time, so you could just disappear. And you probably got some money already, a little bit, and you got some clothes and stuff that you could probably sell to somebody, like the blanket, maybe a little bit of equipment. You don't have your weapon just yet. You'd have to get that when you come out to your assignment. But you could just leave. Fighting with locals. They would have challenges, and they would get drunk, and they would go to the local bar or tavern, and they would get drunk and have bar fights. There's a lot of stories like that. Now, fast forward to the end of the enlistment. So if you enlisted and it took you that long to get out here, now you're at Fort Concho and your enlistment comes to an end in 5 years and you were here. How do you get back if you want to go to the East Coast again? If you want to get back to Pennsylvania, you have to start the process in reverse all over again, where now you have to find transportation to get to the rail line, and then maybe from the rail line you can get back east. But the military is only going to provide a small amount of transportation costs for the individual soldier to get back to where they wanted to go. And that might not be enough to buy the train ticket. The next train station may be 85 miles away. It may be 100 miles away, depending on location. There's a story of a soldier and maybe 3 or 4 others that had just got their enlistment, the end of their enlistment. So they were discharged and there was nothing there. And this was in the winter, so what do? They trekked out in the snow. They said they almost got frostbite. They had to, sleep in the snow, and finally, after some weeks, finally made it to a rail station and made their way back. But you had to make that journey once again, leave on foot to reach the nearest railroad. And it could be extreme weather. Think about doing that in the summertime here in Texas. We had 105-degree days here, and global warming and climate change, who knows, but it was hot back then too. And the climate in Texas was dry and hot, depending on location, and right here in West Texas, so you had those extreme temperatures that you had to go through. So your travel pay was based on mileage to the shortest mail route between it. And so they would calculate this, but sometimes it didn't quite work out that way. And if the soldier was stuck, he might have to have some of his own money put on top of that so that he could make his way back. And sometimes it was just such a hassle to try to get back somewhere, you just stayed right here. And a few soldiers would do that as well. Depending on the post that you were stationed at, you might just stay in the nearest town or start buying up some land and maybe starting your own little ranch if you had the money to do it. Dr. Samuel L.S. Smith was an acting assistant surgeon at Fort Concho, and he arrived here in 1878. And so I wrote my thesis over Dr. Smith. And luckily, I was able to locate a lot of his letters and postcards that he had written back to his family. And so I got back into all that, and I found all of the postcards on his journey to Fort Concho. So in January 1878, this is the 17th, he was in Philadelphia after visiting Washington, D.C., and I'm sure that's where he would figure out what assignment he was going to have. Because he was a civilian doctor, but he was given a contract by the military to serve at the various posts throughout the country. So January, he's trying to get his assignment. Now, March 12th, he's in Jefferson City, Missouri. He's leaving for the Southwest, but he got a sleeping car at St. Louis through Houston. So he's going to hit Houston at this time. This is 1878. March 13th, he hits Denison, Texas, arrived about 5:45 in the afternoon and leave for Houston, still in the sleeping car. Probably had to put a little of his own money for the sleeping car, I'm assuming. March 14th, the next day, arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning. No train to San Antonio until about 8:30 the next morning, so he has to wait somewhat. March 15th, arrived in San Antonio at 8 p.m., and he went to the Minger Hotel. And in his postcard, I thought it was very interesting. He says, "I saw the Alamo by moonlight, and it's a very curious building." That time, it was a supply depot for the military. That's how it actually got its roof and top, the church part of it. So he sees the Alamo and he sleeps in the Minger Hotel. March 21st, he finally receives his orders for his final destination. So probably from Washington, D.C., these locations, he said he was told to go out to Texas. Then when he gets to the Department of Texas in San Antonio, he's told he has to go to Fort Concho. Well, there's no rail line going to Fort Concho at this time, so he has to get on a wagon. His final destination is Fort Concho. The next morning on the 22nd, he's going to leave for stagecoach and make his way to the fort. In 2 days, he arrives at Fredericksburg to rest somewhat. Then on March 26th, he arrived at Fort Concho at 3 p.m. and reported to the commanding officer, which was Colonel Benjamin Grierson of the 10th. And that's where he would meet and greet, and this was the last place that he would serve. He would be out in the field for many years, but in 1881, he decided to stay in San Angelo and started a private practice and a drugstore here in the town. Okay, next one. Francis French, who was a lieutenant in Company K of the 19th Infantry, actually rode the railroad to San Angelo. So right after the rail line came in, he actually rode the railroad, some of the first of the passengers to actually come to San Angelo. So it reached San Angelo, but officially tickets were only available for individuals as passengers to Ballinger. So I don't know exactly how it would work to finagle your way to San Angelo, but your ticket was just to Ballinger. But he nonetheless made it. So he rode into San Angelo on the morning of the 10th, and this is 1888, September 10th. He was somewhat nervous, he said, crossing the temporary bridge over the Colorado River. Probably a little rickety as he was going over the Colorado River. The rail transport was pleasing to the lieutenant, and he considered it a vast improvement over the stage or ambulance. So wagons. Going by the other options would have lengthened the journey some 10 hours. So time was of the essence, and he made it 10 hours the better. At the end of the Indian Wars era, in 1890, few of the old forts were still garrisoned. By 89, when Fort Concho actually closed, Texas had decreased its troop strength to about 1,900 soldiers total in the entire state. And that would be down from anywhere from 4,500, 4,000 to 4,500 at its peak points, maybe 5,000 at different points. So it was decreased quite a bit, troop strength. And that would be in 10 posts and cut at the rail cost to that $30,000 that I referred to. Network of rail lines and roads now crisscross the entire region of the west of the Mississippi into Texas by that time. Of course, the Native Americans had been forced onto the reservations by this time, and so the need for the military presence was starting to wane, which was one reason why the fort was closed. So a large military presence was really not needed. New and larger towns are starting to spring up. The town of San Angelo or San Angelo, and they would be connected by rail lines, but you already start seeing the military start to really think about, do we need a military presence out here? So, it gets to the closing of Fort Concho and why I think the military reasoning might have something to do with the rail line. And I've just pumped up the railroad and how good it was and transportation costs and all the numbers and how you could get troops from point A to point B. And now I'm going to go the opposite way and kind of tell you how the railroad might have closed Fort Concho. But by 1882, Commanding General of the Army, General William Tecumseh Sherman, in his annual report to the Secretary of War, Robert Lincoln, he had suggested that the abandonment of Fort Concho be made, especially since it was established on leased land. So in 1882, he's kind of talking about it, but mainly for economic reasons. We're tired of paying leases to these people, and do we really need it? By 1882, he's saying no. Now, here's some quotes for some other people. So John Grierson, who was the colonel's brother, said, "That's the most godforsaken part of Uncle Sam's dominions out here at Fort Concho." Colonel Grierson said, "Now, if I knew that I should be compelled to stay a very long time at Fort Concho or in the Department of Texas, I think that either drunk or sober, my decision would be to resign and get out." And then the same Francis French that I showed you a minute ago, he said by the time he was there, 1888, 1889, "The buildings are old and there's an air of dilapidation about the whole post. I sincerely hope it will not be kept up." Okay. In 88 and 89, some citizens and then some prominent commanders and some prominent people in government in Texas were sending out endorsements to keep Fort Concho open. They wanted to have it stay as it was. It was an economic boost for the city, and the city wanted it definitely because the soldiers had money and the soldiers came down and they bought stuff. And then at this time, by the late 1880s, the relationship between the soldiers and the townspeople was a lot better. Instead of going down into the bars and having a bar fight and drunken bar fight, people from the town would come over here and they would sit on the parade ground by the bandstand and listen to a Sunday concert. So there was definitely a change in the relationship between the citizens of the town and the military. So here were 3 official endorsements in 1889 and the early part of 89 in March, trying to get them to keep Fort Concho. Okay, go ahead. This is the Dallas Morning News of March 9th, 1889. And it says, "Letters have been received by private citizens here from Senator Koch, Representatives Kilgore and Latham, and from the sons of General Schofield, Commander of the Army, saying that they would do all in their power to have Fort Concho made a permanent post. Keep it here." Okay? So that's March 9th. Now fast forward to April 17th. It was announced at Department Headquarters in San Antonio today that an order will soon be issued for the abandonment of Fort Concho near San Angelo. Only one company of the 19th Infantry, Captain Powell, is now stationed at Fort Concho, and this company will be transferred to the post at San Antonio or Mount Vernon. So they're going to close it. So this was April 17th of 1889. They are getting ready to close the fort. But what happens in 1888? Finally, in 1888, San Angelo gets what it's been wanting for some time, the railroad. And this is not this railroad. This will be the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe. And it will arrive in 1888, and then in 1889, the fort will close. Now you think, well, the railroad comes, and now troops can be brought in, and food can be brought in. But remember when we talked about how we don't need the military presence in the West as much because the Native Americans had been forced onto the reservations. The fighting was not really there anymore. We were leasing all this land and spending all this money to keep up these posts, and we just don't need it anymore. So in thought and in theory, really, if we ever needed a military presence, we could put them on the train and have them out here, and that would be so much cheaper. Even if we had to move them from San Antonio out here, if the rail line is coming in this area, it would be a lot cheaper than keeping these posts up. So by this time, 1888, 89, you really only had about one company stationed at the fort, and the military is still talking about closing it. And it's almost the same idea as the modern military when they look at these Air Force bases like Goodfellow and what they call the BRAC closures, Base Realignment and Closure Acts, and they say, do we really need to pump money into that site? Because Goodfellow was on the list a few times, and the citizens of San Angelo were up in arms saying, keep it, keep it, keep it, because it's an economic boost to the city, and we love the military, and, well, it's almost the same thing as what happened in San Angelo. So this is the first railroad depot for the Gulf Colorado and Santa Fe, and it was built in 1889 between 4th and 5th Streets on Chadbourn. So are you familiar with where it's located or where it was located? Because it was demolished in 1947. If you go down that area, you'll see the Catholic Outreach Building. That is exactly why it looks like it does, because they mimicked the depot, the original depot that was in pretty close to that exact location. But when the first train arrived here in September of 1888, the depot was not created yet. So they had some kind of temporary stop. And then finally, 1889, that was completed. This photograph which was on a postcard, was from 1908, and it was done by Henry Ragsdale. So a little bit about the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe. Again, the map is really detailed, but you can see the lines coming up and then the branching off of some of these lines. And so San Angelo will be right in this area right here. So it was chartered in 1873, to really get a line from Galveston to the interior of Texas. Again, coming off the Gulf, the ships have the goods, the ships have people, onto a rail line and get them to the interior, not just military, but anybody. People, animals, goods, whatever. Offices were actually located in Galveston. The terminus, the end of it, was to be Santa Fe, New Mexico. Construction would begin 1875. By 1879, not a lot had been created. It was a very slow process. And there was some money problems. And actually, one of the people who would help to found this, George Seeley, he purchased the company at foreclosure to satisfy a $250,000 debt. So they were in financial problems, financial trouble, and George Seeley will purchase it. So now it was reorganized. Construction would begin again in 1880. By the end of 1881, there was about 291 miles between Richmond, Houston area, and Fort Worth. In 1882, the company purchased some more rail lines that had already been created, so just gobble those up. The main line extended in 1886 with 132 miles between Lampasas and Ballinger. So finally, 1886, it hits Ballinger. But it was the Texas and Pacific that hit Abilene, so a totally different rail line. So finally, 1886, it hits Ballinger. In 85, there was about 700 miles of tracks, but not financially strong. It's teetering, and that's kind of the story over here sometimes. It's financially difficult to keep and create and consistently repair and upgrade rail lines. By March of 86, Seeley and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe president, William Strong, had reached an agreement that the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe would be part of that company. It would keep its name for a while, but eventually it was gobbled up. So it was a subsidiary of the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe. It continued to operate as a separate organization, but under that umbrella. Then finally, in 1888, the company completed the 35-mile extension from Ballinger to San Angelo, and this became the terminus off of that line. I think it was 1910 that it finally reached Sterling City, but 1888 it finally reached San Angelo. So September of 1888, the citizens of San Angelo were preparing for the coming of the railroad. This was a big, big deal. Think of it today as the new interstate highway coming through San Angelo. It would bring more travel, more commerce to the city, and in fact, they're talking about doing that in the next few years. But this was a very big deal. Bringing a railroad to a location, to a site, can make or break a city. Abilene and Buffalo Gap fought for the railroad. Who won? Abilene. Buffalo Gap is not much, but Abilene won, and they got the railroad. A little bit of dubious means probably and underhanded dealings will happen with something like this, but that will make or break a city. The citizens of San Angelo, the prominent citizens of San Angelo, would come up with thousands and thousands of dollars to kind of fill the pot and to make it appealing to come to San Angelo. So they would do a lot of the clearing of the right-of-way and clearing off some areas that might be stops and maybe helping with some of the rickety bridges that would go over the Colorado and other locations. So they pumped in a lot of money to it because they knew how important it was to get it here. So this was an advertisement that was put out by the man who was in charge of the celebration. He was the marshal of the parade and everything else, and his name was S.W. Titus. And so he is sending this out to all the prominent citizens of San Angelo, telling them what they need to do for the parade and for the celebrations coming in. So it's all laid out by individual. So this person has to bring in this, and this person has to do this, and this person has to do that. And he's got it all laid out, ready to go. And this is September 12th, I think it was, that he sent that out. So September 17th, 1888, and the total amount that was raised by the locals was $85,000. That's a lot of money at that time. And again, that was for road beds and grading, and this is all from Runnels, this is all from Ballinger. You had to come that, 35, 36 miles from Ballinger to San Angelo. And so here's a photograph of the so-called parade. Some say it was a mile long, some say it was a mile and a half long, some people said it's 2 miles long. I don't know, I guess a mile-long parade is pretty long in and of itself. 2 miles is even better. But whatever, they had a major parade. And remember all those individuals? They had floats, and they might have themed floats. Maybe it was a business-themed float. The military at Fort Concho had a little bit to do with the parade as well. And I don't think they were necessarily the band playing, but they may have been shooting off the cannon and the artillery as the railroad, as the train came in. But they had a little bit to do with it. And you can see this is the original courthouse right here. It was a 2-day celebration, the 17th and the 18th. Titus was the Grand Marshal. They had speakers that would come out and give speeches, including former Governor Frank Lubbock, so a prominent name in Texas history. They had shooting matches. They had a baseball game with the Fort Concho baseball team. Fort Concho team won, I believe it. They had horse races, artillery shots from the Fort Concho cannons. They had a barbecue, which was a little distance away from this point. I think they had to go like 4 miles up the river to an area where they had it, and they had about 4,000 people take part in this barbecue. They had 200 sheep, or they say, quote, 200 muttons and 60 beeves. And that was for 4,000 people. Now, the problem was the 4,000 people took all the utensils and plates. They were supposed to leave them behind, but most people took them as souvenirs, I think. So they mentioned in the newspaper article after the fact that they had took a lot of the utensils and plates. To end it all, September 18th, there was a dance, a grand ball that they had, and that kind of ended the events. So for the city, I mean, this is a big deal, but for the fort now, this is going to be the last nail in the coffin. Because again, the lack of need for a military presence, period, at most of these frontier posts. The threat of Native Americans, bandits, outlaws, or whoever else was in this area was not there anymore. And you only have just scattered few companies stationed at these posts. Now the railroad comes through, and if you ever needed to, just put them on the train and have them out here very quickly. So we're looking at Fort Concho closing. So it was decided in 1888, as we saw from that little newspaper clip, that they were going to close the fort, and it was June of 1889. And so this was a newspaper article, June 22nd, and it talks about, at noon on Thursday, the last gun was fired. The Stars and Stripes slowly descended from the parade ground where they had, I can't even read that, it's so blurry, where they had been in West Texas for about 23 years, and Fort Concho was abandoned. With deep regret, we saw the boys march away. They have been an interesting and profitable part of society and commercial life of San Angelo for many years. So citizens were sad, but not sad enough to come out and give a parade and a big send-off. And that's kind of one of the myths of Fort Concho closing, is they said they had women out here crying and waving their handkerchiefs, and they had bands playing and people saluting them as they were leaving. It wasn't like that. They lowered the flag and they had to march all the way to San Antonio. The railroad is here. Why not get on the rail line and send them to San Antonio? That last company of the 19th Infantry had to march from here to San Antonio because it was cheaper. So Fort Concho is closed. November 30th, 1888, medical records at Fort Concho, Dr. Charles Gandy, who was one of the few officers left at the post by 88, 89. The advent of the railroad has given increased facilities for the purchase of articles for messes, food, and has decreased to a slight extent the cost of living for the town. But the military, it was kind of the last nail in the coffin. So the railroad brought commerce to the city, but it was also the death of the stage lines. Once you start having more passenger trains coming in, it was a lot cheaper and a lot quicker for you to travel on the rail line, and so travel by stagecoach was waning. Not completely gone, but starting to wane quite a bit. It marked a turning point for San Angelo and in some ways extenuated the futility of the Army presence. And that was my point there, that you don't need them anymore. The railroad comes in, there's no use in keeping soldiers at a post that we don't own. Fort Concho was just left in 1889, and so it reverted back to that Adams and Wicks group, and then they sold it off. And the military literally did not really own the buildings and didn't want to take the buildings with them. They weren't going to take the rock apart, so they left it. So just don't need the military presence. It brought an influx of farms to the flatlands east of town, boosted the wool business, and kept local businesses competitive with surrounding towns. So for San Angelo, your cattle, your sheep, the wool industry, of course, was big in San Angelo in the 20th century, still some today. You could utilize that railroad and make some money off of it. So it was a boom economically for the farmers and ranchers in the region. It was the terminus of the Santa Fe at this point, that extension, until 1910 when it finally hit Sterling City, as I mentioned earlier. Arthur Stilwell's Kansas City, Mexico and Orient Railroad come in 1909, but that's going to be another story for somebody else to talk about, right? Okay, I hope I've enlightened you a little bit on the military use of the railroad, its connection with Fort Concho, and does anybody have any questions about anything? Yes?
The city hall that you showed in that picture, where was the original?
Very close to where ours, the courthouse is right now. So 2023?
So they tore that down and built.
Yeah, go back and show them that beautiful building. Yeah, next one. There you go. I would rather have that. Not that our courthouse doesn't have architectural elements that I really like. But I love that, and that's a Ruffini building. Oscar Ruffini was an architect who would come in, and he was a citizen of the town. He built the courthouse. He built a lot of the downtown buildings, a lot of the businesses that still remain, some private homes, and that was a Ruffini courthouse. And he and his brother, his brother kind of concentrated in the Austin area, I believe, they built a lot of the courthouses from the 19th century, early 20th century.
Did he also build one in Sherwood?
I don't want to lie to you. I want to say yes, but it probably was. But yeah, that was the courthouse. And I'm assuming this is probably Beauregard right here. Yeah.
That's where?
I do have, though, the only thing that's left of it, I have the lightning rod in the Fort Concho collection. And there's a couple of stones out there, but really that's all that's left of it is that lightning rod.
What were the buildings used for after the soldiers moved out, when it went back to the leasers?
A variety of things. So now you inherit all these buildings, and what do? You're absentee landlord. Your headquarters for your company is in San Antonio or Austin, and you have all these buildings. So they would eventually sell them off, and people use them for various purposes, for living. Some people would buy up a few buildings and they would have them as separate apartments or for rentals. Even into the 20th century, when Goodfellow would begin, there were some officers that actually rented a couple of the officers' quarters over here at Fort Concho because that's all that was available at the time. We have a lot of people that come to the site and say, when I was young, I lived in this building and my mom and dad had this room and we lived there from this point to this point. But different things. There was a hotel put in Barracks Number 3, and there was a fire in that building and it destroyed a lot of it. There was 2 structures that were removed so that they could put a street through. So if you remember the old Fort Concho, and I don't, but I've seen a lot of photographs, there was a street that went right in front of the headquarters building that connected Avenue B and Avenue C. And that street was put in about 1904, and they had to remove the guardhouse and they had to remove the ordnance house. Okay? So I found an article that was 1950s that the ordnance house was taken apart piece by piece and was brought over here to Washington Street, and that's the Weatherby Electric right over here. So if you go to that, they have their main building right here. You go in and, where they meet and greet and tell you what you need. And then they have that bigger building that's on the side they use for storage. That's the old ordnance house. They took the rocks apart and put it back together right over there.
And then did the city buy from the people that were?
It started out with Miss Carson, Ginevra Carson, who would purchase the headquarters from private ownership, Mr. R. Wilbur Brown. And then one by one, piece by piece, the museum would buy back the structures. And then finally, and I can't even remember what year it was, 65, that the city of San Angelo kind of started having a hand in it, not necessarily coming in and buying all the buildings, but helping out the site. And so it was one by one, piece by piece, we would have to buy back each single piece of property. And it started with the headquarters, 1928, and it ended, I say end because there's not really any other buildings we can get. It ended in the 1990s with the 2 barrack buildings, 1 and 2, where the visitor center is right now, and that whole block behind there, which was where the stables were located. And the original site was 1,600 acres, anywhere, and I've seen different records, 1,400 to 1,600. But imagine you've got the Concho rivers that make a V, and then to Bryant, and then a little extension that goes all the way out almost to the Ben Ficklin area. And that was the boundary of the fort property. And so that's what they leased from Adams and Wicks for that 200 to 300 a year. Okay, yeah.
Okay, and if the train station was up there by Chapman Street,
Mhm.
when was this one? 1910.
Yeah.
Okay.
Was there a reason they moved it from Chapel?
There were two different, road lines. So
Yep.
this was the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient. So it was going from Kansas City, Missouri, all the way to San Angelo, and then it would eventually go to Mexico to the Pacific that way. So 2 separate.
And so this one that I'm talking about goes from the Gulf to New Mexico,
Yeah.
and then the one here comes more north down.
And there's a map right here
Yep.
that you can see how that line went. So there were two different
Yep.
companies essentially building the
Mhm.
original line.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, well, appreciate it. Thank you very much.
With that, twice as hard.
Hi.
For all of us. It was awesome. That was great. You're right. Wasn't, I think it was during a Fort Concho speaker series that they were talking about those parades, and that the horse race track was out where the golf course is now. Somebody,
Yeah. So
Could
the
see
country,
it.
the country club out by the Country Club Road and that Grand Canal area.
well, no, I thought it was the one up here off of
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I think you are right.
everybody was out there.
Okay. Maybe
I
right.
thought,
Yeah, Ethicon area.
yeah,
Yeah, that's what you're talking about. Yeah, I think you're right.
what's the name of that? No, I forget. Yeah, the golf course out there.
Quicksand.
Quicksand. Quicksand. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I think you're right.
The only town that doesn't have water that has so many golf courses.
And it always green for some reason, you know? We don't have water.
It's gonna be worse. Eden's, it's gonna be worse.
Hey, thank you for coming.
Eden's got a golf course and it's terrible out of track.
Where?
Eden.
Oh, we made it. We made it.
It's right along here.
Now,
Okay, yeah, that's a lot of comparisons.
It's
Sure.
going across, right next to the highway.
I appreciate you coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's, doesn't look good.
Well, thank you for coming. That's-
Thank you. Thank you. No, we got it. Thank you.
It's definitely got me looking on this one, because I only heard about this one yesterday.
Oh, okay.
And then
Just barely made it.
history department's doing their whole